Hi, welcome to The Selfish Griever. Before we get to today's episode, I wanted to make an exciting announcement. I have had so much success in lining up guests for the Selfish Griever podcast that I now have content planned out through the end of March. And as such, I've decided that I'm going to add a weekly episode on Wednesday that's a solo episode of me talking about my perspective, and then it'll be followed up by the guest interview on Friday with questions and expansion on my Wednesday episode. So I hope everybody looks forward to some extra content and some more opportunities to get some personal perspective from me. As for today's episode, I want to make sure and give a disclaimer of sorts. It is a really emotional topic that I talk about today, with some hard things to hear. And so if you're a grieving parent, I just want to warn you to protect your tender heart. And if you're what I call grief adjacent and just an interested listener, I want to warn you to maybe not listen to this episode on your way to work or before you pick up your kids, because it might be emotional for you too. I actually had to take a break in recording this episode because I had what I would call a grief hangover for a couple days after the first part of the episode because the emotions were so big. And finally, I just want to be clear, everybody's grief journey is different and happens on its own timeline. And today's episode is just my perspective on Orion's death that happened 2 years and 7 months ago. Thank you for listening. Let's start the episode. This is the Selfish Griever podcast, and I'm Whitney Samarano. I've been a grieving mom since June 2020, when one of my twin sons died in an accident when he was 2 years old. I help moms who have lost a child navigate grief spiritually and find purpose again. This is a podcast where we'll talk about the grief journey for moms, spiritual support, and following intuition as you move forward. On this podcast, you'll hear mine and other grieving moms talk about their story, as well as interviews with professionals in the spiritual community. Welcome to the Selfish Griever podcast. If you're new, I hope this podcast supports you on your grief journey. I thought a lot about this episode's content and what I was going to say. I don't have a script because I don't really know how to write a script about the night your son died. And this isn't a night I really like to talk about. I'm not really sure if it's because I still hold some shame that my son died, or if it's because it's still hard to say out loud some of the things that I believe about that night. Not because I doubt them, but because it feels weird still to say out loud that I believe some of those things that happened that night happened exactly the way that they were meant to. And that there were things happening that night that were for my benefit. I don't know if you've ever felt like something happening in your life or things are just coming together exactly the way that they're meant to. Like everything's just clicking and flowing and it's so easy and you're hardly even having to try and everything's just coming up aces. That's how it felt before Orion died. COVID had started. We had just moved into a new house and my house was full of boxes and I was home alone with the boys because their dad had an essential job, so he was going to work still. He wasn't on quarantine. And after the first 6 weeks, I was losing it. The boys were losing it. They were constantly fighting with each other, attacking each other, and they were just so stir crazy. And we had a really amazing time those first 6 weeks. We would do these outdoor picnics in the backyard. The weather was great. The boys loved it. There were so many really nice memories that I got to make with the boys those first 6 weeks in our new house. And then I called my mom, who lives not far away, and asked her if we could come stay with her because she has a pool. And I thought at least I could take the boys swimming twice a day, burn off some of this excess energy, and help get back some semblance of normalcy. And so she agreed, and we packed up and we went. And then once I got there, I had started thinking about going back to work and finding a new career, something that I enjoyed and that had a promising future. And as I was researching around, I got connected to somebody who ended up offering me a job spur of the moment in Yuma, and it just seemed like it was the perfect fit, that it was exactly what I was looking for. And I was able to find a preschool that was open and could accept the boys, and then they could go play and be around other kids. And it all just seemed to be clicking into place. So my mom said we could stay there and live with her. We had planned for a year. And I remember a couple weeks before Orion died, coming home from work, and my mom wasn't home yet, and I took the boys swimming. We had these swim vests for them that wrapped around their chests and arms and seemed foolproof. And so I would take them swimming all the time, by myself. And I remember taking them one afternoon after work, and we had music playing and they were splashing and I was swimming with them, and it was just so idyllic. I remember thinking, life can't get any better than this. That even with all the crazy stuff, happening in the world and in my personal life, as long as I had my 2 boys, then everything was going to be fine. And a few weeks later, my mom was going to go visit my sister in Denver. And then Maverick came down with a low-grade fever. And mind you, this is in June of 2020, so the height of COVID and COVID concerns. So her trip got postponed, and the 4 of us got quarantined together. And I remember being, irritated because I had just started a new job and wanted to be there. And at the same time thinking, well, there's nothing I can do about this. So, I might as well just enjoy. And now in retrospect, I think it was a gift, because a lot of the last pictures that I took of Maverick and Orion were from that time that we were all quarantined at the house. And a few days after our quarantine ended, I got this phone call from their dad's cousin. And she told me that she has these dreams sometimes that tell her things. And she was really worried because she had a dream that something was going to happen to one of the boys. And she didn't know what it was, but she was really worried and she wanted me to know. And I remember reassuring her, thinking like, oh, she just, misunderstood or, has it confused. And I told her, well, we just, thought we had COVID, but it turns out everybody's fine and we quarantined and it's all good and everybody's safe here. Everything's okay. And then about a week after that, my mom left to go to the trip to Denver. And it was just me by myself with the boys, which was a lot to handle. So we had coordinated for their dad to come on the Friday night and stay for the week until my mom got back. And on the Friday night before he got there, my aunt and uncle came over and brought my 2 cousins who were in college at the time. And we had a big swim party. And we ordered in pizza because that was Orion and Maverick's favorite. And we were all swimming in the pool together, and I was talking to my cousins, they're, 2 boys, about their friendship as brothers. And then I really admired them because they were, close in age and shared a lot of common interests and friend groups. And I told them that I was going to need them to help teach my sons how to be friends, because I know that's not just something that naturally happens. It takes effort. Then they went home when the boys' dad arrived, and they handed them off. And we all went to bed. And the next morning we got up, and it was a fairly routine day. Unfortunately, I wasn't there for most of it because it was so rare for me to get time alone that I took advantage and went to Target and went out to lunch and came home. And we had 2 babysitters for that night for the boys so that their dad and I could go out on a date. When I look back now, I'm so grateful that Orion's accident didn't happen when those girls were babysitting him. That his accident happened probably 6 hours later. Because I don't think that they could have handled what was about to happen. And grief does a lot of weird things to your brain. So there are definitely things I don't remember as clearly. And then there are parts that are so crystal clear. One of those parts was putting the boys to bed that night. Orion and Maverick were both diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder level 2, but they exhibited different symptoms. And for Orion, it was very limited direct eye contact. And although he was always an affectionate child that he liked to be picked up, he didn't really like kisses or having his face touched. But that night, when I laid him down in bed, which had been an ongoing ordeal, trying to teach them to stay in bed. They were 2 very active little boys and had reached a point where cribs could no longer contain them, and it became dangerous because they'd be climbing out of them. So we were transitioning to toddler beds and had made a whole bedtime routine that we had been working on and trying to perfect over the last couple weeks. So I laid Orion down in his bed and was talking to him about that it was time to go to sleep. And I leaned in and gave him a kiss on his cheek. And he giggled and laughed and then smacked his pillow twice with his hand. And so I leaned in and gave him another. He did that 3 times. And I just remember being so amazed because he never liked to have his face touched. And now in retrospect, I realize it was a gift because that was the last time I got to kiss my son. So we put the boys in bed and I shut the door. We had been experimenting, like I said, with a lot of different routines and techniques to try and get them to go to bed at night. And we had a child-proofing lock on the outside of the door that we had been using. But recently, Maverick had been getting really upset when he would realize that the door was locked from the outside. And so the therapist we'd been working with remotely had suggested that we try not locking the door so that Maverick wouldn't get panicked. And I completely agreed with. I didn't want Maverick to feel panicked. It wasn't that they were in trouble. It was about trying to keep them safe. But it always gave me anxiety as well because what if something happened and I couldn't get into the room fast enough because the door was locked from the outside? So we didn't lock the door that night. And I stayed on that side of the house folding some laundry. And I remember being exhausted and I really just wanted to go to sleep. And Orion came out once and thought he was, getting away with something and playing. And I saw him right away and said, "Hey." And he laughed and giggled and ran back in the room and shut the door. And I didn't open the door again because I wanted him to just get back into bed and I didn't want it to turn into a game. And I stayed over there on that side of the house for about 15 more minutes, and I didn't hear anything else. And so I was hoping that he had fallen asleep. But I was too afraid to open the door and check, because if he was awake, then it was going to start, the routine all over again. But we had a baby monitor in that room, and the receiver end was in the bedroom we were sleeping in. So I was confident that if he continued to mess around, we were going to hear something. So we went to the bedroom and we watched a TV show. So we were awake for at least another hour, and we didn't hear anything on the baby monitor that indicated the boys were still awake. And so we went to bed. At the time, my mom had a large German Shepherd and a small terrier mix. And I also had a large German Shepherd and a Dachshund Yorkie mix. So there were 4 dogs in the house. And the house had these large doggy doors, big enough to accommodate German Shepherds, that led out to a back patio that ran the length of the house, connecting with the bedroom that I was sleeping in that night, and enclosed fully from end to end with floor-to-ceiling wrought iron barred gates for security. And so for the dogs to get out to the yard, the gates had to be open. But we left them primarily closed so that the boys couldn't get out to the yard. And since they were so large, they were quite heavy. We never locked them because we didn't think that the boys could move them on their own. And anytime they got moved, they made a loud noise as the metal wheels rolled on the metal rails. It was pretty unmistakable sound. And those wrought iron gates served as the protection and security from the pool. And Orion loved to be outside. So we would let him play on the patio with the gates closed. His particular favorite was to take chalk and color all over that patio, all over the outdoor furniture on the patio. And I used to wipe it all down so then he'd have a clean slate to start over again. And my mom also had a separate dog yard on the side of the house that after we moved in, she had AstroTurf installed in that yard because Orion loved to go in that yard so much, which he was allowed to go into because it too was fenced and had a secure gate to the backyard, preventing any access to the pool. And for some reason, even though every other night we always shut the doggy doors so that the boys couldn't access them to get out, I forgot that night. I don't know now, looking back, if I had a reason or if just in the hustle and the bustle and change of routine, I didn't think about it. But that night we took the dogs outside to go to the bathroom, brought them in, put my mom's terrier in her crate in the master bedroom down the hallway from the room I was staying in. And I don't remember where the other dogs were. I think they were just loose in the house. And everybody went to sleep. And I never heard a thing. And then, at a little before midnight, I heard my mom's dog crying in her crate from down the hallway. And it woke me up. And I was half asleep and I was irritated, thinking, that darn dog, we took her out to go to the bathroom before we went to bed. Why is she crying now? And I got up and I walked down the hallway and I let her out of her crate. And then I walked to the back door in the kitchen to let her out. And in my half-dazed state, I saw the window to the boys' room that faces the patio and realized the lights were on. And I remember thinking, that's odd. I didn't leave the lights on in that room. And so I walked over to their bedroom, and the door was open, and every single light in that room was on. And Maverick was asleep in the bed, on his back, completely out, and Orion was nowhere to be found. And panic started to set in. But I was trying to calm myself, saying, it's fine. Orion probably just went somewhere else and fell asleep. He'd been known to do that. He'd be so rambunctious, he would just run and run and run until he would finally, fall asleep right where he was at. So I looked all over the room quietly and quickly to not wake up Maverick. And when I was confident Orion wasn't in there, I turned the lights off and shut the door. I ran to the side yard where I was really desperately hoping he would be, that he had just, gone out the doggy door and was out in that yard. But I couldn't find him anywhere in there. And as I was in that yard, I realized I didn't have to open the gate for the dog to get to the backyard. And I ran through the house and out the back door. And the gate was open. And I could see from the light of the pool, Orion was in there. He was fully clothed and ghostly lit by the light of the pool. And I dove in and I pulled him up from the bottom. I recently saw this post from a dad talking about strength training so that he can always carry his child for as long as she wants to be carried. I always think about that night and what would have happened if I hadn't been strong enough to lift Orion out of that pool. He was always the lighter of my two sons, but lifting him that night was the heaviest thing I had ever had to carry. And it was dark everywhere else in the backyard. And I remember thinking, this can't be true. Somebody has to fix this. And grief is such a hard burden to carry that a lot of times there's not any room for anybody else's grief. So I've never asked his dad what it was like for him to be woken that night by my screams, to come out of the house and find me in the backyard with our son laying on the ground, to hear me yell, he needs to call 911. And so he had to turn around and leave us out there to go back in the house and get a phone. And there's like a blur of all the things that happened after that. Emergency personnel, flashing lights, people checking on Maverick. He slept through the whole thing. Over a dozen first responders in the house. Lights on everywhere. Talking and noise. Maverick was always the one who woke up in the middle of the night to come climb into bed with me and snuggle. And that night he didn't wake a single time. Which even in those early moments when it was so hard, I could recognize the gift in that. Maverick never had to witness anything that happened that night. He has his own trauma, of course, because he went to bed one night and when he woke up, his twin brother was gone. But he didn't have to experience the fear, and I didn't have to try and comfort him while I was falling apart. And as they worked on him doing something that I already knew was hopeless, this police officer directed me to sit in the family room, and he sat with me. I don't remember everything I said. I was definitely in shock. But I do remember repeating over and over that I killed him, that I was supposed to keep him safe, and I killed him. And I believe that that police officer in particular was the one meant to be sitting with me right in that moment, orchestrated by the universe, because he told me that it wasn't my fault, that he had kids, and he knew how hard it was to keep them safe all the time, and that I didn't do anything wrong. And finally, at some point, they decided it was time to take Orion to the hospital, and they wanted to know if one of the parents wanted to ride with him in the ambulance. And I realized I didn't even have shoes on. And while I was rushing to go get shoes, they ended up having to leave without me. And so a sheriff escorted me. I rode in the front seat. I remember wanting to be as physically far away from anybody as possible. And I got to the hospital. He had to take me to the ER waiting room entrance because we weren't with the ambulance, so we couldn't go in through the ambulance entrance. And I had to wait for them to get me a mask because I didn't remember to grab one. And then they escorted me back to a private waiting room. And I remember that I sat on the floor crying, thinking that I didn't even deserve to sit chair because I was this horrible person who didn't keep her son safe. And even though I knew from the moment that I pulled him from the pool that there was no hope and he wasn't coming back, the doctor came in and told me that his heart wasn't beating when we got there and that they could stop now or they could continue for another minute. And even then I couldn't tell him to stop. And they escorted us into the room where they'd been working on Orion. And it was the middle of the night. So there was no priest there. There was some ill-equipped spiritual advisor. I don't even know if that was his title. I don't remember. I just remember he was not very supportive. And the things he said didn't help at all. And Orion's dad was raised Catholic, so he asked for a priest for last rites. And that spiritual, whoever he was, guy explained that that wasn't possible because of COVID, that there was no priest available. And then another police officer, who again I believe was meant to be there right at that time, stepped up in this really hard moment. And he didn't know us at all. And he looked young, so I don't even know how he had the wherewithal to think to offer this. But he asked Orion's dad if he could pray with him. And I will always appreciate that because I was not in a frame of mind that I could be supportive at that moment. And so the universe sent somebody else who could be for Orion's dad in a moment when he really needed it. And then the detectives showed up. They said they had some questions. I answered them. They were relatively innocuous. And I remember asking, what happens next? And thinking in my head that they really should arrest me. Because it had been my job to keep him safe. And I clearly had been negligent because he was gone. And the detectives just looked at me and said, there's nothing. This is it. And so then we had to go home. And for the first time ever, I had to leave my son somewhere that I wasn't coming back for him. And I almost couldn't do it. I remember falling down in the parking lot outside the truck and telling their dad I couldn't leave him there. And he told me, Whitney, you have to get up. Because we still have Maverick. And he needs us. And what happened next was mundane compared to everything else that had happened previously during the night. We got home and the investigators were still there. And they finished up and they left. And then we were alone. I couldn't understand how anybody would leave us alone there with Maverick after what had happened to Orion. And the next morning, I think about 6 a.m., because I tried to wait for a reasonable hour, I called my aunt and uncle and my cousins who had just been there the Friday night before. And the first thing they heard on Father's Day of 2020 was that Orion had died. And my uncle had a priest come over to talk to myself and Orion's dad. He was there for quite a while, but the only thing he said that stands out to me now is when he told us that we have the capability to control what memories we focus on from that night. And so as best we can, to try not to focus on the traumatic ones. It's easier said than done. And it's taken me a lot of time and a lot of processing to get to this point. You don't just magically wake up one day and realize that in the midst of something really horrible and tragic happening to you, there were moments of support being orchestrated by an unseen force that you couldn't have predicted or controlled. And I look back on that night and think about the things that if even just one of them hadn't happened, Orion would probably still be here. If the gate hadn't been left open, if the doggy door wasn't open, if the baby monitor had picked up noise, if I had locked the child-proof lock on the outside of the bedroom door. But also now, with this new perspective that I've cultivated over the last 2.5 years, I recognize those thoughts for what they are, which is wishful thinking, because it's not what happened. And I don't know that if any of those things had happened, that something else wouldn't have happened that still would have led to Orion dying. Everybody has to, unfortunately, figure out for themselves what they believe and what supports them on their grief journey and in life in general. And for me, that's been spirituality, learning and accepting that my soul is here for a bigger purpose. My soul's here for a learning experience, something that I believe my soul decided on before I was even born. And Orion's death is tragic, and there's still lots of days that I would trade all this growth to have him back. But I also truly believe that there's really nothing else that could have happened to me in my life that would have been as big a catalyst to prompt my growth and change. I think anybody grieving can't deny the change that they go through. Whether that's a good or bad change is really up to them. Because looking back on that night, I recognize there were so many things that I couldn't control, mostly because I just didn't even know. It never occurred to me that Orion would ever die. But I can control the way that I choose to live my life now, what I choose to believe in, and the people I decide to surround myself with. Not having absolute control doesn't mean that we don't have free will. And so now I take that free will and intentionally decide to connect with my son Orion, who's on the other side, and learn more about what my soul's purpose is for being here, and try to support other grieving parents like me who are doing the same. Thank you for listening to the Selfish Griever podcast. I hope you're enjoying our episodes and finding them helpful and informative. I wanted to take a moment to talk about how you can help support the show. As you know, producing a high-quality podcast takes a lot of time and resources. From recording, editing, and promoting each episode, it's a labor of true love. But I couldn't do it without the support of listeners like you. I've set up a Patreon page where you can become a monthly supporter of the show. Your support will help me cover the costs of services to produce the show and invest in better equipment in the future, as well as keep bringing you new episodes every week. But here's the thing. I don't want you to support just because I asked. I want you to support because you believe in what I'm doing and you want to be a part of it. That's why I'm offering 3 levels of support and some special perks for our supporters at each tier, like personal shoutouts at the beginning of the episodes, behind the scenes content, and for a small group of only 50 listeners who donate $20 a month, access to a live Q&A twice a month. So if you believe in the mission of the Selfish Griever and you want to help me continue to bring valuable content to our listeners, I'd be grateful for your support. You can find our Patreon page by clicking the link in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for listening and for your support, and I'll be back next week.